Okay, so welcome to our latest virtual bridge session. Here today with Jason. Oh, not a stranger to the virtual bridge scene, clearly, but you're bringing an insight of what the digital future will look like from the perspective of our students, which is really where the heart of the matter really should lie. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued because I know I have my views, but I always want to know what others are thinking. So, Jason, clue us in.
Thank you very much, Kenji. And the good news is I'm not so much bringing insight as questions, and I'll be expecting discussion from participants as we go along. Obviously, we've had a lot to think about in the past year and a bit with the changing circumstances within which further and higher education has been delivered. And now's the point where we're getting to think strategically about the longer term and what happens. And there are a number of reviews indeed going on at the moment with regards to how that looks. What I'm going to look at today is from the learner point of view, learner experience point of view. Then what will we want to take into the future? What are the ongoing implications for the way in which further and higher education has been delivered during the pandemic circumstances? And what do we go back to in terms of the offer? And again, from the student perspective. If you've been following what I spout about now and again, you'll know I'm quite passionate about those who currently don't get access or find it difficult to access the current models of delivery of further and higher education. We know that the particular models that have been used are sometimes make it difficult for those who have got a different work-life balance, perhaps, or need to access learning in a different way. And so one of the things I'd like to consider is about how we can either extend or change the model under which education is delivered in order that more people can participate. I'm going to look at three different areas. First of all, I'm going to consider flexible learning or flexibility of learning. Then I'm going to look at immersive learning, and then I'm going to look at the student or learning journey that a learner might go through longitudinally throughout their life. After each of the blocks, flexible learning, immersive learning, and the journey, I'm going to open the floor for a bit of discussion each time. So be ready to contribute with your questions. And we'll start off with probably the most meaty one about flexible learning. I recall a colleague of mine whose daughter went to Australia, and she was wanting to do a nursing course at a local institution, and she went in to find out about it, and she asked, when does the course start? And she was asked, when would you like it to start? And they had devised it in a way that, well, you could take up the course at any point. And also there was a question of what days does this fit into? And she was asked, well, what days can you do? And that particular course, and the way it was set up, allowed for quite a flexibility of approach there. And I ask you, well, how much does that go for our courses that were offered here? I know of instances, and admittedly a few years ago, where students starting a full-time undergraduate university degree maybe missed a few weeks or even a couple of months due to illness, and have been told that they need to come back a year later, indeed, and restart the following year and find something to do in the meantime. Is that something that we want to hold on to as a model? I think what we know is that citizens generally have got a varying learning demand throughout their lives. Some points there's a definite need, other points there's the possibility of background learning, if you like. And at different points in our lives, we all have different capacity to learn as well. So looking then at our delivery of formal learning, then for practicality's sake, and perhaps because of the nature of qualifications and delivery, formal learning comes in blocks, of course. And we tend to have a start date, we tend to have a target finish date in which we gain a qualification. And then we may look to move on to another block of learning, another qualification. So we've looked at flexible learning in terms of any time and any mode. And I find it interesting that we still use the term part-time. Part-time, of course, has got a reference to something other than full-time, and the norm stands at about 40 hours of engagement a week. In my experience as a lecturer, I do remember, and it was a while back, but still full-time students telling me in a tutorial about how difficult it was balancing the part-time work that they had to do to fund their learning versus their full-time educational demands. And so we need more dynamic, more flexible delivery to allow different paces of engagement, different types of engagement. And also there's the huge question that has come up about any place as well. We know there's the role of the what the role of the campus is in terms of, well, access to technical facilities, especially in skills development and indeed research at universities. Then access to technical equipment is key, and it may also extend to access to a very high quality, reliable internet access even. And that goes into the second element of why campus is important, and that is the learning environment. Sometimes it's not conducive to learn at home for whatever reason or elsewhere, and going to a place which is designed for learning is an important part of engaging in education. And finally, we understand the social and community aspects of attending the campus as well. Of course, there's a balance between flexibility and recognizing the place of the campus. And any pace. Interestingly, we talk about lengths of courses, a 15-week course. Well, is it 15 weeks for everyone? Is that the ideal? Is that about the practicality of delivery rather than the ability of each learner to take up that learning? So what sort of possibilities have we got going into the future? Well, I think we've already recognised that we readdress the balance between synchronous versus asynchronous delivery. Obviously, there's the greater potential for flexibility in asynchronous activity. Of course, that has to be balanced against the fact that we lose out on sometimes on the community feel of learning, the social nature of learning, if we have asynchronous. And again, that's a matter of degree and a matter of good learning design, how that's allowed. Technology for access. So for example, if there is a synchronous event, a lecture, for example, then obviously this past year and a bit has moved forward the ability to access that lecture from afar. And for some learners, that can be sufficient. And for some learners, that may be necessary because of other things happening in their life. And the question is then, how do we best increase and improve the community feel of involvement? More varied learning design has already been happening to us as well. And I have to say, I was myself taught and indeed delivered in an age of fairly limited learning design. We had the mechanisms of lecture, we had the mechanisms of discussion and tutorials, and we had the mechanisms of reading. That was pretty much it. With greater interactivity, with more variety, then things have already become more flexible in a way. But there's the question of practicality still. There's the downside of if you let everyone learn flexibly in the way that they want to learn, then you lose the sense of cohesion. And also from the delivery point of view, it becomes more complex. I see there have been some more comments. I'm going to invite anyone to open their mic and make comment on how they see the flexibility agenda playing out in their context. And unsurprisingly, Kenji's the one putting the comments in. Kenji, what matters most to you, and how do you see the balance between flexibility and practicality going?
So I think the issue with flexibility for me is especially when you mentioned full-time and part-time, because full-time as a notion, when I first went to university, I was staggered about how little I actually needed to attend classes. So it did give me enough time to do a part-time job and really support myself through the experience. But I suspect that part-time, full-time is really related to other things like the benefits and rebates that we can receive once we're recognized under a particular status. And just another aspect, just wondering, when we talk about flexibility, bringing students in to perhaps do a course over a shorter period of time, we also possibly want to recognize the skills that they bring with them into a course and experience. So how do we recognize some of that prior learning? And that's all part of the mix for me. And I'm not sure that I have a clear answer to all of those things, but definitely worth considering.
I think that fits in very nicely with Walter's point that he's made there, and you might want to come and elaborate it. But we talked about cohorts, and of course, it's not always the case, or maybe seldom the case, that cohorts come uniformly. People come with different backgrounds, different preferences, different prior learning, indeed, as was mentioned. And so it's and whether I suppose there is that balance between feeling the community of a cohort and the social element of learning together versus the flexibility of providing each student with the circumstances in which they want to, when you can best thrive in the learning environment. I'd be interested to know if there's any particular changes you see as being either enduring or yet to come, which will improve flexibility for learners. Walter, you've come off mute there.
The point about the cohorts was it was really to address a really serious issue of non-completion, because students didn't feel they had any kind of frame of reference other than their own engagement with the material. And these cohorts, we ran them every 6 to 8 weeks. So it wasn't as though you had to wait a whole term. You could join, but you had to join at the beginning of the next month, kind of thing. And it really did help with the retention, and also the students seem to get a better learning experience from it.
And I think we've learned, we learned quite a lot, I think, from MOOCs, and the fact that the completion rates for MOOCs are pretty low. There's engagement in learning, but that total flexibility means that it's easy for people to drop out and not feel the support that will get them through to the end.
Mm-hmm. And just one last thing, I think colleges have always been pretty good at being flexible, and I've got quite a number of examples of, especially from the health and social care sector, of allowing times to change. The day ran from 10 to 3 to allow mothers to drop and pick up kids from school and so on. But that whole question about part-time, full-time, yes, I think when you look at the modes, if you look in the SFC data form and look at all the different modes of delivery, and you're scratching your head, you think, what's the difference between PTD and and evening delivery and Saturday morning delivery? How do you differentiate between these different means of engagement with education and training?
And I think then that does have the two elements to it. First of all, if you're joining a course in a cohort of 1, then that's a very lonely experience. It might suit some, and it depends what the learning is. But it does not mean you don't have the social element of it. And again, that leads on to questions as to then about well, if a type of learning, a particular learning opportunity can be made available more widely, whether we're looking to bring students who are interested in learning something together to manage numbers, and using the technology, for example, online to bring cohorts together. And in many ways, that's the UHI model of bringing learners from different places together to form a cohort. And maybe we'll see more of that sort of model happening. I'm going to move on. There can be an awful lot of discussion around that then, but on to immersive learning. And I go back to 20 years ago. That's where I started this journey to where I am in many ways. And it was, I made up some self-assessment questions for students, and this was in the area of business law, and these were for non-law students. And despite me attempting to be as engaging as possible in my lecturing and tutoring, then I do remember these large group of students going over to the library and getting totally hooked on doing these self-assessment questions on the computer. it was that degree of involvement and that efficiency of them testing themselves out on self-assessment questions, and me being around to deal with the questions that came up, flitting from student to student to give them help where they needed it, that it led me to this area of educational technology in many ways. And those students were immersed, and they were immersed in a way and engaged and interacting in a way that I wasn't able to do in a plain classroom. And so that's where it got me there. Now, immersive learning can happen in many ways. I personally find a good book, paper book, to be immersive. But we can also have immersion through technology. And sometimes I've caught myself thinking, you know, all these rather addictive games, get to the next level, accumulate, whatever it may be, that people get addicted to. I wish I could have made business law like that. The unput-downable business law. Now, people are obviously immersed in different ways. Different methods of immersion appeal to different people. As I say, some people really like a good paper book. Other people might want to play whatever pet Candy Crush or whatever is available. Yeah, lots of different things there. And I do remember myself some of the things that I've come across. I have my virtual reality goggles here, and I remember using them for the first time on the very simple Google Earth to move around. And I put my goggles on, and 5 minutes later, it was in fact 1.5 hours later. Where had the time gone? Because I had found it very immersive. And likewise, and even before that, when BBC Bite Size came around, even though I have an interest in history, it's not something I've ever had time to take up in a meaningful way. Again, meaning to dip into BBC Bite Size to see what it looked like. And again, 2 hours later, I was still being lured to click through the next thing and get me hooked on that. So I wonder, is there something we can learn from immersion and look at that? First of all, about personalization of experience. We know that what is immersive for one person isn't necessarily for the next. Sitting in a small group in a classroom may be the most immersive experience for one learner, whereas going on to a virtual reality environment and being able to control that in other world might be the best for another. If we can take immersion as being the feeling of being somewhere else or some time else, then we have got immense possibilities. And I'll stick to the history example. Rather than reading about the Roman world, then being able to enter it and experience it in a way, it has got to be, for many learners, to be quite a revolution indeed. And therefore, what we might need indeed is easy use tools that allows this to happen. And it can happen on different levels. If, for example, I'm engaging in a lecture, then I can sit in the room, I can watch on a 2D screen, and those ones are actually relatively simple. Or maybe actually the simplicity of sticking on a headset, if that's the way I want to engage with it, and feel as if I'm sitting in the lecture in a more meaningful way, in a more realistic way, might be available soon. So the ease of the tools and perhaps the ease of the resources, in fact, to achieve immersion, both ease of for the learner to access and both, and the ease of the tutor in order to set up may be important. Do we see that immersion as being important in the future? And can you see further higher education changing as a result to take that forward? I shall open the floor for any comments or questions.
I just want to come back to one very quick law example, and it's one that we've discussed before, Ard Colour. And when University of Strathclyde created, when it was presented to me as this virtual town in which all of these law practices had interacted with virtual businesses, literally it was at the time of Second Life. So when I first saw the project, I was like, oh, excellent. Okay, I'm going to get to, see the 3D representation of the world. And when I can't remember, Simon, was it that when they showed me the project and it was wikis, bulletin boards, but once they started explaining that it was all about live projects, about clients coming to you, setting you tasks, and you having to interact with other businesses, which were groups of students working in real time. It was fascinating. I loved that. I knew nothing about law. I desperately wanted to try something like that.
And I think that engagement's important in that immersion and the different Yeah, it doesn't have to be high tech, and I'm showing my age here, but I remember back to the days of BBC Micro and Elite, where actually trying to dock by rotating at the right speed as a sort of letterbox, and then typing in how much grain you wanted to buy and transport across the universe was immensely engaging, and many more examples of a fairly simple engagement that is immersive because you feel you've entered that world, and it's grabbed your attention and keeps you there as well. I think so. And there's a lot to be learned from gamification that we know. We also know that gamification doesn't appeal to everyone. After doing a year of learning Scots Gaelic, then I'm rather tired of Duolingo's gamification of language learning, for example, and eventually deleted the app to stop myself getting hooked on just another day's streak. But still, it does have its place, and we do know that gamification and the various ways in which even marketers keep us engaged in things is something perhaps we can learn from in education more. That's a rhetorical question as I go into the third element, and it's kind of time for questions and reflection at the end. And the learner journey, from the learning point of view, and I wonder if there is more ways to engage. At the moment, I don't think we have many people who are engaging in both further and higher education at the same time at different institutions. One might say that a lot of learners are doing different types alongside, but perhaps we need to be able to look to ways of facilitating people gaining the relevant mix of skills. And I can think of examples where actually the ideal for a learner point of view, maybe not for delivery, would be taking a mix of, for example, improving their maths at a sort of school level, and we do know that, for example, higher maths can be sat at colleges, and often happens, and so there's already some mixing there. And then taking up some further education type skills, and maybe some higher education type, higher academic analysis at the same time. And I wonder, again, going back to that question of through our professional lives, if we're looking at lifelong learning, there are points where we have greater and lesser educational needs and greater and lesser capacity to take up the learning. And I wonder if we can do more in the sectors in Scotland and Northern Ireland in order to improve the accessibility of it. Now, obviously ties in with flexibility, but what does the journey look like? And also, can we integrate that journey more closely? And certainly, with the review being conducted by the Scottish Funding Council at the moment, then one of the things is looking at whether our sectors can be more integrated, more connected in order to provide for post-16 learners. There's a question about interoperability and coordination, and yeah, I wouldn't want to be the timetabler working out how to combine learning from 3 different institutions and their synchronous aspects as well. But again, I wonder what we can do to improve that learner journey, and also perhaps, and for me, this is something that very much interests me, as to whether we can keep more learners engaged at all times or most times. At the moment, I'm not engaged with, in terms of learning, with a further or higher education provider. I wonder in time to come, someone who might be able to entice me to subscribe to an institution and give me a range of things that I might dip into, dip out of, qualifications I might work towards. Sometimes I might do those within a certain time period. Sometimes it might take years. Sometimes things that take years will go out of currency, so I don't get a qualification because I've taken too long. Other things, if I'm studying medieval history, the fact that I take 3 years to gain the qualification will not really make much difference. So I wonder if we can change the model in order to have more longitudinal lifelong learning, perhaps, and more varied lifelong learning. I'll let people come in with questions and comments at that point.
I can't stop myself, and I know we only have about 4 minutes left, but I was always intrigued in one of the university programs I was involved with in Japan. The PhD students were allowed to join any course that the university was running. They were allowed to drop into any lecture if they thought it was relevant to their area of study. And I suddenly realized at that time, there were actually quite a lot of courses when I was an undergraduate that I would have loved to jump into around psychology. And I was kind of denied entry to it, understandably perhaps, but because it was me. But I would have loved to have just experienced different subject areas not related to my particular pathway. And I wonder if an increasing flexibility for online provision and different ways to access the material would give students, especially at Scottish universities who have that extra year of study, to just experience a little bit more. And that'd be a wonderful thing for me. Missed out on it now, but you know, I live in hope.
The pay-per-view lectures that people can just dip into. It might be a difficult marketing job that's in that area, but perhaps something for the future.
Walter, you mentioned something about MOOCs.
Yeah, no, it really was a question. I mean, I know that there are this kind of collaboration between HE and FE. There are little pockets of it, Jason. And I know that we do use things like Khan Academy and instructional videos. So people are thinking about using engagements out with the college to enhance the experience. But I wasn't sure whether I've ever come across a college making a full use of a MOOC, you know, from higher education to as a means of engaging its students. Do you have any examples?
I can't think of any examples of that, partly because of the requirement for it to fit in with a qualification. Obviously, that's I think that's the downside of it, or the limitation at the moment of that. Certainly, I know that the students have been referred to some MOOCs as a learning resource as part of learning and a qualification, but not one where the FE provides the support and the structure for students to engage with a MOOC. But it's an interesting model.
I know that in, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, sorry, Kenji, if I was delivering the HNC machine learning unit, I would just use a Future Learn MOOC for it. I wouldn't, you know, there's no need to go and reinvent all your own materials, because I wrote the unit and I know what I used as the background. All right. Sorry, Kenji.
No, now I'm going to go away and take that course. But I know that without naming anyone, so two Scottish universities were looking at using MOOCs as part of their undergraduate delivery. So for some of the modules, and they both fell down. And in one case, one university had said that they didn't want to offer the content from the MOOC to their students because they thought it would devalue the course in itself, the notion of what you were paying to attend that particular undergraduate course and the status of that particular university would be devalued if you thought you were just doing a free course as a module. And that was a very strong internal argument. And the second course, a separate university, refused to use the MOOC content because they couldn't openly license some of the content that they wanted their students to cover. So they were restricted in terms of the amount of content that they could give over to students. So those are two technical areas and one political area, perhaps. One question that I'm interested in from the student perspective, and it's not one that students would normally like to express, is that we've seen in this lockdown period that perhaps students at a kind of pre-HN level have struggled in terms of motivation and engagement to stick with flexible courses and flexible means of learning. So what's your ideas or thoughts around how in a college being told to turn up somewhere at a specific time for a specific number of hours gives people the kind of structure that they need to complete a course, where that rigidity can be seen as a disadvantage in some cases. For some, it provides a stability that allows them to progress.
It does, as long as they can turn up at that place at that time. And so obviously that discipline and structure is important to some learners. And the big question is, how do we provide the balance such that those who benefit from it get it, but those who can't fit with that model can still access the education somehow? And one of the key factors, I think, is what I call, and many have called, readiness to learn, rather than readiness to teach. And there have been many times where quite frankly, I've been faced with a class. I've been standing at the front and thinking, the learners in front of me are not in a place where they are ready to learn for whatever reason. And again, yeah, as you say, this past year has been very indicative of that. And again, that question of, if a student, for whatever reason, there can be many, hits upon a circumstance, and that can be a life circumstance, a financial circumstance, a mental health circumstance, or a physical health circumstance, that they need to pause their learning, or they need to reduce their capacity to be able to take it, then can we do better, and can we use technology indeed to be able to allow them to continue rather than drop out? Again, I know that colleges and universities have been doing a lot of work on this and on retaining students and helping them to get to a position of attainment. But I think there's probably more that can be done there to allow that flexibility.
Okay, and that brings us neatly to the end of this Virtual Bridge session, but does introduce the idea of Virtual Bridge session ready to learn, delivered by Jason in a future session. So until that very welcome moment, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and watching us on YouTube. And until we meet again, stay safe.